All right. So again, my name is Pablo, and I'm with the Climate Emergency Unit here at within the Sustainability Hub, and currently calling in from the traditional ancestral non-ceded territory of the Musqueam people here at the UBC Vancouver Point Grey campus, and also recognizing everyone might be calling in from other lands as well. So I welcome you to share your, introduce yourselves in the chat and where, whose lands you are on currently. And I also want to recognize that there might be participants calling in from the Okanagan campus as well within the Syilx Okanagan Nations territory. Um, my I myself, I am a mixed Japanese settler who's relatively new to these lands as a recent immigrant. I'm incredibly grateful to live and work here and to have heard stories shared from Musqueam elders and knowledge keepers about these lands and the waters and their culture that I will forever hold dear in my heart. And as you are aware, this Friday is Orange Shirt Day and Truth and Reconciliation Day. And it is a day to honor the survivors and those children who never made it home from the residential school systems that unjustly removed Indigenous peoples across so-called Canada from their lands, their families, their communities, their cultures. So we must recognize that this truth and the healing and accountability are absolutely essential and central to addressing the past and ongoing harms that are continued through the systems of colonial oppression that continue today. So I want to encourage you to reflect and learn and take part in events and gatherings and calls to action that are happening on Friday, but also not just on Friday. There's days leading up to it where there's other ways to get involved and to learn. And as, of course, long afterwards as well. Reconciliation and decolonization. There need to be acts of everyday learning and unlearning that translate to action directly. So it's really about changing the way we think and act within ourselves to change the systems we're in and build relationships with people and the land and water and air that are grounded in reciprocity and respect. Before we move further, I just want to share in the chat at least some of the events and learnings that are directly related to what's happening in the Vancouver and Okanagan campuses. So just share that with you today. And that also brings us to today's event. It's really about this act of climate justice. What does that actually look like? So today we have this really unique opportunity to learn about how that is reflected through everyday actions and the behaviors that we take, not just individually, but as whole collective institutions or systems. So, it's about learning how to step more lightly on this planet. And in this case, it's directly applied to flying and being stewards of the air around us. So UBC is committed to reducing its business air travel emissions by 50% by 2030 as part of its bold climate action plan. And this broader commitment to climate justice that's made in the 2021 Climate Emergency Report and recommendations. So it's an area of immense grassroots action and advocacy, as you'll see today. It's also where there's institutional supports that are being built, as you'll also see today. And at least for myself, I can speak to the Sustainability Hub. Our role has really been to convene and coordinate around UBC's climate emergency response. And it's really not just like the Sustainability Hub, it is a whole sort of ecosystem of people working towards these complex issues. And so our unit itself provides university-wide strategic support for UBC's climate action leaders to advance that collective impact towards climate justice. And there's much energy that's brewing around this critical topic around air travel. And so, especially for universities, universities play an instrumental role as air travel does eat up an enormous proportion of our scope 3 carbon emissions, as you'll learn more about today. So with that, you'll actually get to hear from the people who have way more knowledge than I do on this topic. And I'm really excited to introduce you to my colleagues and peers and just they're coming from a variety of different backgrounds and units at UBC, so they're taking this challenge to task. So it's really great to work with them on this. And I hope it's an opportunity for all of you who are joining today to learn from them, as I have myself, and to also utilize the tools and gifts that they bring with them today. So we'll hear from a few folks joining us. So we have, you might be able to maybe wave to the crowd. So we all know who you are, but we'll hear from the Library Climate Action teams, Elizabeth Stevenson and Mathew Vis-Dunbar, who are joining us. And they've co-developed a tool to support decision-making on air travel, which we're excited to hear more about. And then we'll also hear from a student, Arshia Uppal, who has done in-depth research, just really incredible research into the climate justice implications of carbon offsets and creating an evaluation tool regarding that. And then we'll also hear from Gavin Esdale, who's the Sustainable Travel Coordinator for Campus and Community Planning and VP Finance. They're stepping in many, many worlds there. And Gavin has an enormous wealth of knowledge on this topic and is an integral part of bringing this commitment to air travel protection to action. So thank you for all of you joining, and seeing a lot of familiar faces in the room. But from here on out, we'll just pass it off to Elizabeth and Mathew to, to hear more about the decision tool.
Thank you so much, Pablo. Yeah, we're really happy to be here, and I'm also joining from UBC Vancouver, so the traditional and ceded ancestral territory of the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, and Squamish peoples. And yeah, so I think we're going to start off, Mathew, my colleague Mathew and I are going to start off running through the air travel decision tree that we created over the pandemic. We had a lot of time to work on it. It was pretty nice to hone pieces with support from colleagues as well. So I'm just going to go ahead and share the screen so we can have a look. Since I've done that, there we go. Okay. So this is this is the document, and maybe Mathew, if you could pop the link into the chat, which you're probably already doing. This is available for download, so anyone can use it. It's just to house it on our library guide, Climate Change Library Guide, and you see it popping up in various places in the university. And so we basically took what other people had started, other versions of a decision tree, and adapted it for UBC, for an academic setting in UBC specifically. And so I think with that, Mathew, I'll hand it over to you and start to walk us through.
Sure, thanks, Elizabeth. I think we'll do a little bit of back and forth, because part of what we really want to try to get at as we walk people through the decision tree that we came up with is how it's kind of contributed to changes in cultures of practice. And one of the ideas that we were really trying to get with it is this idea of stimulating conversation within the library about travel. So for those of you who are not maybe part of the library, or depending on where you are in your academic career, one of the things that you start to realize is that travel can play a significant part in one's career and one's career advancement as we work through the metrics of how we're evaluated within an academic environment, whether that is as an academic or as a librarian. And the really kind of like when we start looking at the air travel decision tree, one of the first things we're really articulating is the climate action plan that UBC's put out and situating the decision tree within that framework. And then what we try to do is we present individuals with a series of questions to really kind of think through as they're thinking about what it means to be participating in their professional in their professional sphere. and what the contributions are that they're able to make, whether that be in person, requiring travel, or whether that is done virtually, and really kind of thinking through what are the kinds of questions that we can ask when we look at the activities that we might travel for. But also, I think on the flip side of that is when we are participating in organizing our own events, what are some of the considerations that we might want to factor in order to be able to encourage individuals to practice with a reduced carbon footprint. So just kind of, I don't know, Elizabeth, do we want to like step through this like stepwise, bit by bit, or do you want to provide a little bit of commentary at this stage in terms of where we're at?
Yeah, well, I think maybe we can very lightly go through and just sort of land on a couple of the key pieces that emerge from the tree. Which I can start that off. That sounds good.
Sure.
So you can see, just framework at the top there, just asking those questions as a decision tree is meant to support, and then. Really, we provide the framework and then the questions to support people in engaging with the decision a bit more deeply, like looking at the different layers and the impact of their decisions. And so really that's like getting down to these key pieces of climate justice. So as you're making the decision to go or not, taking into account the impact on other people who are impacted and in these various ways, and then also how to get started, in your own journey of moving towards those UBC goals of reducing your emissions by 50%. And so I'm just going to, I think this first page is pretty straightforward, and you're all welcome to, take a look after the talk. But maybe I'll just come down to the decision aids page, which is a bit more in it, and this is kind of where, we talk about career stages, and this is geared towards academics, but I think it's something that students can also start to think about. Graduate students also go to conferences and present things, and so it's certainly something that people can start to think about in those situations. And I'll just share actually. A colleague at Polytechnique Montreal shared a story where there were a few graduate students at that institution who had various papers they were invited to present at a conference overseas, and so they had to face this decision. And so what they decided is just to send one person to present all of the papers, and then take turns in that regard, so thereby reducing their footprint. So there are lots of different creative ways to address this. For students as well, but our decision tree is a bit more geared towards staff and faculty. As faculty, it's a big footprint at UBC, the amount of travel that's done. So these decision aids, where you are in your career, taking that into account, and again, how important is it that you go just really digging into those questions that can be a little less comfortable, because they do also sort of shed a light on the privilege that's inherent in air travel. And so it can be uncomfortable. And that's really, this tool, I think we really set out with the goal of stimulating and normalizing conversations and actions to taking actions to reduce the emissions. So, and this is sort of where I'm at, 2 years down the road, like the conversations is kind of what it's all about, just having those conversations and just continuing to deepen them and create those relationships and connections so that it does become normal and more comfortable as we all move forward on these pieces. Mathew, did you want to add anything to that at this point?
Yeah, I think I'll just kind of say that when you talk about the notion of privilege and assumptions in this, really part of what we're trying to do is we're trying to get people to ask questions that takes into consideration some of those assumptions that we might have originally had moving into an academic career with the expectations that you would travel, and really kind of pulling apart why it is that expectation is there. what the end goal of that travel would be, and whether or not there are alternative ways of thinking about how we can hit those same end goals without having the level of environmental impact from the amount of travel that we might have historically assumed that we would have to do to be successful in an academic career. And I think there's the flip side to thinking about that from a really personal perspective and how your decisions are going to impact the environment. The other side of it as well is just knowing that that level of privilege also restricts the number of individuals who are able to participate oftentimes in these activities. And so, for example, working with Sally Taylor, who's on the call here right now, we belong to an international organization of librarians. And one of the things that we discovered is that during the pandemic, when travel was not actually an option, the level of participation that we've had in that organization from international partners who otherwise would not be in a position to be able to fund that travel, let alone make a decision around whether or not that travel is something that they have a choice to participate in and what the consequences of that are. That level of participation has drastically increased, and that has actually been really beneficial for the organization and for information sharing capacities within that organization. So really kind of getting people to think about in that conversation, reevaluate where they stand in relation to this, and where they have choices that many others would not have that choice, even though they're in the same profession.
So I'm just taking the time, and I think at this point, if we maybe open it up to questions. So our plan is to take a couple of questions if there are any, or comments right now, and then we'll change lanes into Arshia's presentation on carbon offsets and climate justice. So I will stop sharing for now. Again, you all have access to that tree, so feel free to have a look later on. But are there any questions or comments, anything popping up for anyone at this time? And we'll have more time later as well. Thanks, Chelsea. Yeah. Feels like it's support, which is what we're after. Okay, well, we'll pass it over to Arshia.
Yep. Okay, sounds good. I'm just gonna share. Oh, could I get screen sharing privileges? Thank you. Great. Okay. I hope you can all see this. Let me know if you can. Good. Okay, cool. Yeah, hello. Thank you all for just taking the time out of your day to listen to us. My name is Arshia Uppal. I'm an undergraduate student, and I'm entering my third year of environmental sciences and ecology. I'm calling in from the Salish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I've been a climate organizer since around grade 10, and I now organize with Climate Justice UBC as well. And organizing and doing all that grassroots work is, the reason I found out I was interested in research that focused on, the interconnectedness of science and justice. And that kind of led me here. So yeah, this is a little bit of what I hope to cover today, just a quick overview. And I also want to give a bit of a preface on carbon offsets before I begin. So just tying into, the idea of justice and carbon offsets, which is mainly what my research focuses on. As of right now, we're kind of in the midst of a very interesting time where environmental policy is being developed at a very astounding rate. And this has created many different unique opportunities for us to witness different forms of policy change, but as well as see still forms of environmental racism. And so much of Canadian law still has a very fresh layer of colonial coding that reads too clearly on it. And therefore, many of these laws still work and are limited by the colonial mindset that they were written under. So recently there's been a lot of discussion around carbon offsets disproportionately harming marginalized communities without engaging in consultation processes or long-term community investment plans. So oftentimes land-based offset projects are created on Indigenous land, and that displaces local communities off of their land, or projects can be created in low-income racialized communities, and that prevents the community to continue operating as it did before project implementation. So oftentimes questions of unfair terms of trade, the unequal distribution of benefits from the project, and the lack of community participation are commonly brought up when discussing offsets. And it's vital to acknowledge that most carbon offset projects do not undo emissions. So although the main purpose of carbon offsets is to compensate for the release of, GHG emissions through carbon storage and or, distribution projects, institutions and corporations, they use carbon offsets to greenwash and display a sustainable and environmentally cautious marketing image. And so greenwashing is when corporations or institutions appear eco-friendly through marketing. So for example, corporations may not make any changes to their operations while they continue to offload all of the responsibility onto offset projects instead. So there's fossil fuel companies out there that have a lump sum of money that they just put towards offset projects to fulfill their environmental quota. And while they continue investing in fossil fuel. And so that's an example of that, that offloading that responsibility and not making that switch. And this allows obviously these companies with fiscal capabilities to continue to fund, corporate pollution and maintain a carbon lock-in. So carbon lock-in refers to the continued usage of releasing greenhouse gas emissions due to the dependence on these storage mechanisms. And that's very, very common in fossil fuel infrastructure. So this dependence allows these large institutions and corporations to take advantage of these projects, and that in turn delays the transition to renewable energy that we hope to reach. This is not just seen with corporations and institutions. Individual consumers as well may use offsets as a license to continue or even increase their consumption. So for example, when you buy an air travel ticket and it asks you, do you want to offset your air travel emissions? And you click yes, and it takes you to a page. That's kind of offloading your responsibility, because oftentimes those projects are predetermined. You don't get to choose what project you're sending your money towards, and those projects could be negatively harming marginalized communities. So using offsets in this way is unsustainable, as climate mitigation demands reducing global emissions to zero. So offsets, just as a preface, should not be used as an opportunity for organizations and individuals to evade, reducing their absolute emissions. Also, there's currently a lack of auditing and verification and, lack of justice and consultation in regards to offsets. So it's crucial that the offsets are not displacing communities and disenfranchising them even more, which is what this research hopes to tackle. But yeah, I kind of wanted to give you that preface before I begin talking about this research. Carbon offsets are quite controversial. And I remember seeing this graph that showed the more a person knew about climate justice, the more uncertain they were about carbon offsets, which was kind of interesting. But yeah, this summer I was kind of hired as a work learn student to continue the carbon offset research we started as a CGRC group of students. So the Climate Justice Research Collaborative, for those of you who don't know, is a program part of the UBC Climate Hub. They do incredible work, and it focuses on integrating climate justice into academia. So the CGRC project initially started off as just trying to find, socially just carbon offset projects to invest in due to that controversy around carbon offsets. So our goal was to find carbon offset projects for the EOAS department so that they can use some of their funds and invest in offsets when they invite, guest speakers, or they have faculty members that go speak at a conference. With carbon offset projects right now, they really seem to lack the whole justice component. Oftentimes that's not a big highlight, or it's not mentioned at all in the report. And even the environmental section is super short as well. So our goal was to kind of bring that to light and make it make it, I guess, more of a thing in carbon offset projects and draw attention to that. So we created an evaluation tool to essentially evaluate all these different projects based off of 3 pillars, which were justice, environment, and functionality. The report we created also included recommendations for UBC staff and departments. And we also recommended around like 3 other offset projects for the committee that we were, researching for. But those projects ended up not being the best, and most of them actually had ties to large fossil fuel companies. So my job as a work learning student was to be like, wait, this is actually not right, and kind of fix that. So our report obviously ran into a lot of issues. It was the first time any of us have done anything research related or anything related to carbon offsets. So the report was super long. It wasn't the easiest to understand, made it very difficult to kind of get people interested in campus. And we were also missing a lot of background information because carbon offsets are kind of a tricky space to navigate when you first learn about them. So we were missing a lot of that background context. But one of the biggest issues I think we ran into was the scaling method. This is not on the slides, but the scaling method we used to evaluate our projects. So before the projects were evaluated, they were based off of the criterion which was mentioned in the project. So I'm going to quickly show you the short guide that I've been working on. This is kind of the work that I've done this summer. But yeah, this is a short guide. Essentially, yeah, this is kind of it, what I've been working on. It gives a quick, introduction to the background of carbon offsets, goes over what carbon offsets are. It goes over, past controversy around carbon offsets. Just I think some things that should be there for people when they're first learning about offsets, or they're choosing to offset their air travel or their transportation, just something to keep in mind. And it kind of talks about all the things I talked about earlier in the presentation. In terms of the next part is kind of the evaluation tool, and as I was mentioning, this was like kind of the most difficult part of our research. What we had before was that it was our environmental, social justice, and functionality. And we kind of had different criteria in each table and looked through all the reports and tried to find if the reports mentioned the criteria. Oftentimes reports falsify this or like leave things out or aren't transparent, so it was hard to rely on that. So this is kind of the new tool that I've created. So it starts with the authenticity, social justice, and environmental, and it's also a tier system. So I'm going to quickly go through all of this, but the authenticity category. So when you're looking at offsets as a whole, there are some general requirements that each offset project should have. So stuff like, additionality, proper quantification, leakage, permanence, like all these variables should be considered within an offset project, within the report, and should be addressed. So in terms of additionality, so if I take that, for example, what additionality means is that if the monetary gain wasn't there, the offset project wouldn't have happened. So meaning if there wasn't money available to invest in this project, the project wouldn't have happened. That's one of the criteria for offsets, because it demonstrates that the money and the investment is kind of pushing for the project and creating the project. So yeah, that's an example of additionality, and it's super important to carbon offset projects. So how the carbon offset market kind of works is it has different registries, such as the gold standard registry, the voluntary carbon registry, the BC carbon registry, and all of these registries have different standards within them. So standards such as the gold standard, the voluntary carbon standard, and these standards within these registries have requirements for all the offset projects, and these requirements are kind of listed here. So in terms of authenticity, I gave it a tier. I gave each standard a tier depending on whether they addressed all the criteria. So if you take the gold standard, for example, the gold standard addressed additionality, addressed proper quantification, congestion, leakage, permanence, and unique ownership, which is why it's given that tier 1 standard. Since all those general requirements that a carbon offset project needs is a requirement for that registry, if that makes sense. So that's kind of what it looks like. The BC Carbon Registry usually uses these standards over here, and it's ranked tier 2. They were missing, I think, unique ownership, which is why they were ranked tier 2. So that's the authenticity side of things. In terms of social justice and environmental, tier 1 is given to the categories that have visible and direct impact. So for social justice, if there are partnerships going on with Indigenous communities where they are, getting benefits out of that, whether that be economical benefits, social services, jobs, community benefits, more, green infrastructure, or so that's kind of the social justice sort of side of it. It needs to be directly benefiting the community and benefiting them in a way that they approve of for the project to reach a tier 1 standard. In terms of tier 2, those are just the basic things that each project should have. So stakeholder consultations, mitigates those social impacts that are harmful that oftentimes come with carbon offset projects. And the same goes for environmental. So biodiversity benefits, improving air or soil water quality. Those are direct benefits that can be measured and are visible, which is why it's a tier 1, whereas tier 2 is more so just the basic things that should be there, which is like an environmental impact assessment. And a lot of projects actually missed the environmental impact assessment. So a lot of the carbon offset projects I looked at said that the environmental impact assessment wasn't needed, and that's that. So it goes to show that these projects are often not considering both the environment and justice aspect. And then tier 3 is kind of, there's just no mention of social or environmental impacts, neither good impacts or bad impacts. So that's tier 3. And this category is more so for projects that I will not be evaluating. So projects that are directly linked to fossil fuel infrastructure and stuff like that, we just decide to leave all those projects be. Yeah, and then this is kind of the pillar weighing options that I included. So I noticed that a lot of people have different ideas on what is most important to them. So for me per se, that was probably justice. So I would rank, justice 50%, authenticity 25%, and environmental 25%. Whereas for somebody else, maybe they want to, weigh them all equally. So for now, there's this temporary Google Sheet that we're using to calculate the projects. So you just input the weighing that you want to give each pillar. You put in the tier that you're assigning it, and then it gives you the overall score. It calculates itself, and that's kind of the tool that we're using for now. Hopefully this will be developed as a web app soon, and we want to put that on the EOAS department website with the short guide so that people are able to easily access it in case they want to, evaluate their own projects. But yeah, and then I included a project evaluation walkthrough. So I just included an example project, which in this case is the Great Bear Rainforest, just because it's so popular at UBC. So I included, some project background, went through all the different pillars. For authenticity, it was given a tier 2, because as I mentioned before, the standard often used for the BC Carbon Registry is the tier 2 standard. It's a BC FCOP, so it's given tier 2. That was pretty easy to find. And then as for environmental and social, it did have both benefits, positive benefits. So in terms of environmental, there were sorry, somebody just entered the waiting room. But there were positive benefits in terms of enhancing all aspects of biodiversity. The Great Bear Rainforest used to be a commercial logging site, and now it's turned into a conservation area. So that's a pretty big environmental benefit. And in terms of the justice side of things, there was a very clear partnership between the First Nations on that land and the third-party company that was creating the project. They also had economic benefits for the community in terms of the project proponents were had a way to distribute the revenue of the project equally on an agreed kind of revenue sharing formula that they came up with. So that was a very clear benefit to the community, which is why I was given tier 1. And then, yeah, I included the final score just for people to see, and I showed different options. The kind of last big part of the guide is the stakeholder recommendations. I have recommendations for UBC campus and community planning, UBC departments, and then just a general one for staff, researchers, and students. For campus and community planning, the biggest kind of request I have for them is to develop a kind of a request for proposals process that aligns with the evaluation tool I've created. So what that could do possibly is, if an evaluation tool is, made, is used, I guess, UBC campus and community planning could then push for that tool to they would create, I guess, a project list out of that tool of approved carbon offset projects that meet this, evaluation tool. And then using that list, it would push third-party offset companies to raise their standard and meet the standard that UBC's at, since they want investment from UBC. This could be done at the department level. It could be done at the research group level. Third-party offset companies know that there's a lot of air travel within academia and would want those investments. And so that's ties into the request for proposals process. There's also some general ones for UBC departments. This is more so just cultural changes that should be implemented in terms of air travel. And then as for just a general one for all of campus, I also linked the library climate action decision tree, because I thought it was very worthwhile and important for people to, judge and see if they even needed air travel in the first place. But yeah, these ones are more of a cultural change that is hard to enforce, I guess. Yeah, and then I included a section that just talks about how to evaluate the projects if somebody wanted to do them on their own, or also purchase offsets, because purchasing offsets is actually difficult in itself. It's a very annoying process, and you have to calculate your emissions and make sure you're choosing the right project. So I included some instructions there. And this is the recommended project list that we came up with. There's 3 recommended projects. I think all 3 of them are from the BC Carbon Registry. As you can see, that's why they all rank tier 2 in authenticity, but 1 for the rest. And then if you look down, you can start to see a slow decline in the ranking. It starts going a little bit red. So it just goes to show that actually a lot of projects don't consider justice and environment. But yeah, I'm gonna go back to the presentation and quickly finish up. Okay. Oops. Okay, yeah, so future projects and plans. So in terms of future projects, something that I'm working towards now is I'm planning to map out the EOAS department's emission usage. So in terms of transportation, shipping costs when they get super big scientific, equipment, tracking who's from where is coming to give a guest speaker, if anybody's coming to give a presentation. Obviously that information is hard to get, and I'm still in the process of doing that. And if anybody has any pointers, feel free to share. Aside from that, I want to do something that we're working towards is doing a follow-up project around renewable energy projects. So what we're trying to do is there's a lot of renewable energy projects in BC that are led by marginalized communities, and they have full lead and ownership over these projects. And personally, I think that is a better investment than offset projects that are created by big third-party companies. So that's somewhere I'm starting to look into now, and hopefully I will do a project around that and add that to the short guide, because those projects seem really cool. And if anybody wants any more information about those renewable energy projects, feel free to reach out to me. Yeah, so that's kind of it in terms of sort of future projects that I'm working on and just the research that I've done already. But if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. For some reason, I can't stop sharing my screen. Okay. I don't know if you guys, okay, there we go. Okay, but yeah, thank you so much for listening to me. Yeah, let me know if you have any questions. I hope that went well.
Thank you. That was such a comprehensive look into it. And yeah, I really hope a lot of people will use that tool when it's ready for sharing. I I don't know if we missed it. Did you say when it might be available for sharing?
Yeah, it's gonna be released soon on the EOS department. It's gonna have the calculator tool as well as the weighing tool. So once I get that out, maybe you guys will see it. Yeah, it should be out by the end of this month though.
It's incredible. Yeah, we'll make sure to amplify that when it comes out and share it with this network here too. So yeah, thanks so much. And we have our last speaker here, Gavin. Do you want to hop in and introduce yourself and share your work?
Gladly. Just a quick check. Can everyone hear me? Oh, my camera just spazzed out. That's fun. There we go. Hi, everyone. My name's Gavin. As Pablo so graciously stated earlier, I am UBC's relatively new sustainable travel coordinator. The position was just created earlier this year. I've been in the role for a couple of months now. I'm primarily based out of the financial operations department, but I make weekly cameos in campus and community planning, as I've got supervisors all over the place. I basically get to jump between 3 different bureaucracies. It's a lot of fun, as I'm sure you can all imagine. So the broad strokes of my job are that I've been presented with UBC's climate action plan and presented with the importance of understanding and trying to reduce, of course, UBC's emissions from business air travel, which right now focuses primarily on staff and faculty. And the approach we're taking to this is one of gentle but firm encouragement. And what my supervisors or my core team and I have been working on are a series of initiatives to better kind of understand the purposes behind staff and faculty air travel, and to understand, I guess, how we can make it easier for people to find replacements for that or alternatives. And in cases where alternatives are impossible, directing them towards Arshia's wonderful guide for choosing reputable and responsible offsetting projects. So it's a little bit of the approach I'm taking is kind of one of a tiered system, very much in line with the library's excellent decision tree, which I'm going to be featured on a website that we plan to deploy hopefully within the next week or so. That will be featured on the UBC Sustain site. We'll be showcasing the library's decision tree along with a handbook that I believe was created a couple of years ago by the geography department. Just as a little shout out to the departments that are taking kind of mindful action towards reducing their air travel. So that's the kind of work I'm involved with. It has the benefit of being very broadly focused within the realm of sustainability, which is great. I absolutely love this field. Of course, it does mean that trying to isolate a single project that I'm working on at a given time is a little bit of a challenge. As I like to say, I'm working in the gray zone, which is fitting considering I'm doing air travel and we live in Vancouver, where it's almost always gray. So following that up, I would like to open the floor for anyone who's got any questions about the kind of work we're doing. I know I just said that sometimes specifics can be difficult to come by, but I promise you I will do my best. If there are any questions about kind of what this role entails, what our approach is, I'd be happy to kind of throw that information out there for anyone who's curious. I should probably open the chat as well. Yes, Christina, it is pretty exciting. Sally.
Thanks, Gavin, and thank you to all the speakers. Do you feel like, or what should I say, are there models out there that you can follow? Like, did you start your job and you're kind of like, what am I going to do? Or are there things that you can look at and see what's been successful in other places and what to not do?
The answer to both is yes. Believe it or not, we have it's cool to be working in a field that is relatively new, but of course by now we all have we have 2 years worth of precedent for reducing air travel just thanks to the pandemic. But given the state of the climate emergency, there's actually a number of institutions that have started doing work on this, but it's interesting because much of it is very much in its early stages. And actually, I owe the UBC library a debt of gratitude because it was through them that we set up a kind of inter-campus or inter-university like community of practice. And we meet once a month with a couple of practitioners who are doing similar work from a couple of different places. Elizabeth earlier mentioned a colleague at Polytechnic. His name's Patrick, and he's done some very interesting work on this. We have met with people from, I believe, Royal Roads, from McGill. We've had a couple of representatives, I believe, from the States. A notable one is Arizona State University, who introduced a really interesting carbon offsetting funding model that essentially gets funded by departments that buy air travel. Now, I have mixed opinions. I have mixed opinions on that approach. I'm of the mind that it does lapse a little bit into moral hazard territory. But what's cool is that there is, to answer your question a little bit long-windedly, there has been some work done. The challenge is just in enacting it, because if we're going to be addressing air travel at one institution, it necessitates kind of trying to address the norm of air travel across more than just our institution. Academia is except in extreme circumstances, usually not a very localized activity, and this leads to some very intimidating but exciting kind of brainstorming activities for how do we want to, with a mind towards the fact that we have to reduce emissions from air travel. That's just a given. What does that mean for the future of academia? So I'm glad. So these are the kinds of questions that are getting asked slowly and with an understandable amount of timidity. But that kind of work is being done. Now it's just a matter of finding the ways to enact it without engendering too much blowback, but also being quite firm about the fact that these are changes that, for good or ill, hopefully for good, should be happening, and done in such a way that no one's career ends up jeopardized because of them. I mean, potentially airline executives, but I'm okay with that. Sorry, did that answer your question? I just want to make sure there weren't any points I missed.
No, it did. Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, if there aren't any other questions, I can give a little bit of a preview for what our team is working on right now. As mentioned earlier, we're hoping to have another site posted to the UBC Sustain page soon. It's going to feature like some really concise point-by-point information for anyone who ends up directed there, who wants to understand how they can get a better handle on why reducing air travel is important, along with some very clear-cut resources for how to do that. Again, thank you to the library for the guide. We're also going to be engaging in some semi-targeted outreach in the next little while. We're hoping to start socializing our program, putting out, just making generally staff and faculty aware that it's something that exists, a good idea of what we're trying to accomplish, and of course, sending out links to our site, and of course, a generic email address where they can send all of their hate mail, if they are so inclined, or all of their comments of support. We welcome those very much too. But we're also hoping to establish a group to advise on some more regulatory measures, taking a look at some policies that have been enacted at other universities and saying which ones do we think might work here in the UBC context. So I'm expecting that to be a very revealing process, and hopefully a productive one. But I'm feeling fairly optimistic about this program's prospects. The team has been wonderful to work with, and the general, I suppose, vibe I get from much of the community is that this is actually a welcome endeavor, and it's exciting to be a part of it. Absolutely is.
If I may just jump in, I feel like we're really lucky at UBC. There's just such a groundswell of people from all over across the campus, and students, staff, faculty who are passionate about it and have just sort of started work on sustainability in so many different ways. And just feels like there's a really strong community and a lot of connections now being made between those different groups. Yeah, so it just feels like there's a lot of support, and yeah, I'm grateful to be here and a part of that.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's absolutely like an appetite to see or to participate in meaningful actions, and this is, to my mind, it's a really big one, maybe an underappreciated one in some respects, but probably not within academia. So again, intimidating but exciting. Culture change is tricky, to put it mildly.
Maybe I'll jump in with if there's no other questions from the group, but I'll give a pause there too if there are more questions. We can open up to the rest of the speakers who are joined us today. So yeah, please do pop in any questions. Oh yeah, Christina, go for it.
Thanks so much. That was really helpful and wonderful to see what's happening. I wanted to ask briefly everyone how they handle this sort of balance, and that was really made clear through that air travel decision tree as well, for more junior scholars or early career scholars, and the need to network. And we know that conferences aren't the primary place to do networking, but there is still this kind of perception, certainly in my field of Japanese studies and literature and other things. And so, you know, I was talking even today with colleagues, and there is a sense that, you know, early career scholars should get priority. And what we're seeing, at least at some of the major conferences, is that the early career scholars go and then those that are more senior don't. And it's kind of, you know, causing other problems because they want to be presenting to this broader audience. So, I mean, we've heard here today that it really involves a much broader cultural shift that needs to happen in academia. And that's where I'm sort of hoping things will go in terms of how we mentor and how we approach these things. But if you have any sort of advice on how to even approach that when we're talking about it, it would be really wonderful.
I can certainly speak for myself on what I would like to see. I'd like to just see an adoption of I'd just like to see a lot more uptake of the use of hybrid like hybrid and virtual conferencing. And that is not to say that we need to completely outlaw like all in-person conferences, although I do think we need to severely, I suppose, reduce the impact that they tend to have. My initial response would have been to offer a hybrid model where you allow junior researchers to go, you allow them to go and socialize in person and network there. And anyone who wants to make a presentation, I suppose a more senior researcher could do so virtually. Like we've all, whether we wanted to or not, we all got a crash course in doing virtual presentations over the past 2 years. So it would strike me as a little bit disingenuous if someone was 100% opposed to that kind of model. But it is complicated by the fact that any kind of collaborative effort that involves a hybrid setup is going to involve a little bit more, I suppose, a little bit more of a tango between all of the participants, and kind of trying to set up those agreements. That's probably beyond what any one of us is capable of, like on a completely individual level. But I think fostering that and encouraging like our own institution to maybe offer that kind of model would be helpful. There's if I remember correctly, there was a paper or a little funny enough, it might have been a presentation doc put out on a similar model. It was I think the multi-use hybrid conference model, or they abbreviated it to be MULCH, which is just a great name. But the idea being that if you wanted to host an international conference, you could actually set up several universities kind of globally, and people would travel to the closest one, and then everyone could conference in virtually. That way you still get the benefits of being able to conference with people with the double benefit of it being more localized. So you'll be meeting with researchers. Who are a little bit closer to home geographically speaking, but you'll still get all the exposure to all the key info from all across the globe. So that's just one example that I think just should be entertained.
Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And I just saw Lisa posted real life example of that too. So it's always great and encouraging to see that action happening in real time, and be curious to see how that goes and hear more about it as well after the event. So I recognize we're closing in on the hour, and so with that, I think we'll make sure to close up. But I guess if any of the speakers here today, if there are ways to get in touch with you directly, if you feel comfortable sharing, your contact information or ways people can stay connected, I'm sure everyone who joined us today would appreciate that. And yeah, I just want to thank you all for taking time today to learn more, and hopefully you have some, actionable advocacy that you can start using these tools and the learnings from today from all of our great speakers. So yeah, just big gratitude for Elizabeth and Mathew and Gavin and Arshia, and then for everyone who came and joined us today. And yeah, let's continue to keep having this conversation and curb those emissions and find better offsets, etc. So thank you all, and have a good rest of your Mondays.
Thanks, everyone.